The pod came in on a misrouted container out of Keth-Sarath. Manifest said industrial sealant compound, 12 canisters, standard freight, nothing that required a live unload. I had the pallet jack positioned and the bay door already folding open before the scanner beeped at me. I almost ignored it. The depot scanner on Bay 11 had been throwing false biologicals since the firmware update 6 weeks prior. Veth Coral in maintenance had put in a repair request. The repair request was aging in a queue somewhere on level 3, behind 17 other items, and nobody had been injured by the wait, so nobody was in a hurry. In the meantime, the scanner beeped at thermal-wrapped machine components, at fermentation-grade sealant, and on one memorable occasion at a bag of dried grain that Pale from the transit cafeteria had left sitting on top of a relay housing while she handled a spill 2 bays over. I had learned the rhythm of it. I checked and moved on. I set the pallet jack aside and walked to the container. The 12 canisters were there, stacked against the left wall under cargo netting, exactly as the manifest described. Against the right wall, half hidden behind the second canister stack, was a heat pod. Compact standard emergency specification, the brushed alloy casing that ships in the survival kits aboard certified transit vessels. I had seen them in equipment catalogs but not outside one before. The status light on the face panel was amber. Not red, amber. I crouched and looked at the panel more carefully. I have been loading freight at Keth-Araval Depot for 9 years. I have handled more manifests than I can count. I know what equipment is supposed to look like, and I know what it looks like when something is wrong, the way you learn any physical language after enough repetition. The pod's casing was the right color, the right dimensions, the seams were intact. The amber light was the only thing wrong. Amber meant reserve power. Reserve power meant primary had already failed. I put my palm flat on the pod casing. Warm, but not as warm as it should have been. The casing was designed to hold temperature for 72 hours on primary cell before reserve engagement. I had no way of knowing how long the reserve had been running. The reserve cell was rated for 12 hours. There was a manual printed on the inside face of the access panel. I know this because I opened the pod before I called anyone, which was not in keeping with compact freight protocol for untagged biological cargo. The protocol was clear. An untagged biological item should be reported to the depot supervisor, logged against the incoming manifest, and routed to compact biological freight processing. In the case of Keth-Araval Station, that meant a 4-hour transit to the impound facility on level 6 and a 48-hour assessment queue. I read the first page of the manual before I made any decisions. Then I opened the pod. She was smaller than I had any frame of reference for. I had seen Velsaran adults at the station, the cafeteria workers, the transit residents, the occasional contractor, and I knew the species from that. Ash lavender skin, the ear points, the amber eyes. But this was a newborn or close to it, and the ear points were still folded against the skull the way the manual's first diagram showed, pressed close and soft, the way young things are before they have grown into what they will eventually be. She was wrapped in something thin and pale, a transit blanket the size of a hand towel, and she was not moving. Her skin had gone the wrong color, not the warm lavender of the cafeteria workers, but something closer to ash gray, the cool undertone of tissue that had been losing heat for longer than was safe. The manual had a name for it. Cold response. Velsaran infants under sustained thermal stress enter a reduced metabolic state. A survival mechanism, the manual explained, that conserves core biological function at the expense of surface circulation and motor activity. The manual described this in the flat clinical language of a document written to be read by people who are not medical professionals and who need information quickly and without confusion. The window for recovery from prolonged cold response in a newborn, the manual also said, was not open indefinitely. I did not route the pod to level 6. I put my hands under the infant with the care the manual specified. Support the head, support the base of the spine, do not apply pressure to the rib cage. And I stood up and I carried her to the break room. The walk from the container to the break room on Bay 11 is not long. Down the receiving corridor, through the pressure-sealed door, left past the equipment rack, second door on the right. 3 minutes, maybe 4. I moved at a pace that was not running but was not slow, and I held her against my chest because the manual said body heat was the intervention, and I had already decided to do what the manual said. The break room had a heating element in the wall, a narrow rest break cot, a table, 2 chairs, a single overhead lamp, and a wall-mounted terminal. It was designed to give freight loaders a place to eat and rest during a long shift. It was not a medical facility. It had no Velsorin biological support equipment. It had a 16-page manual that I read in its entirety 3 times in the next 40 minutes, once while standing and twice while sitting on the cot with the infant held against my chest and my jacket wrapped around both of us. The manual was thorough. This is what I remember thinking as I read it, that someone had sat down and written this with the specific intention of giving a non-specialist exactly enough information to sustain a Velsorin infant in thermal distress until a qualified person arrived. The language was plain. The steps were numbered. There were no assumptions made about what the reader already knew, which was fortunate because what I already knew was nothing. Body heat, direct contact sustained. Velsorin thermal receptors in the first weeks respond to contact warmth, not ambient temperature. A radiant heat source is secondary to direct mammalian contact. I adjusted my position and held her closer. Monitor for recovery indicators. Skin color returning toward the species normal lavender register. Ear points beginning to unfold from the neonatal folded position. Limb tension easing. A recovering infant will begin to move slightly, small adjustments, not the stillness of crisis. Respiratory rate increasing from the depressed cold response baseline toward normal. Nutritional needs. A recovering Velsorin infant of this developmental stage can take standard compact nutritional supplement solution at a concentration, the manual specified precisely, in milliliter quantities, at intervals of 3 to 4 hours. The manual noted that the nearest source of compatible supplement was likely a station medical annex or transit medical facility. I read all of it, then I called Veth Coral. She was the right person to call, not because of her seniority exactly, but because Veth Coral has been at this station longer than anyone else in the depot, and she has a quality I value. She assesses situations accurately before she reacts to them. When I told her what I had, she did not say anything for 3 seconds, which is her way of processing, and then she said she would be there in 10 minutes. She arrived in 11, with a thermal wrapping pad from the emergency medical cabinet under one arm and the portable heat lamp from the equipment room under the other, and she looked at the infant for a long moment without speaking. Then she went to the break room terminal and began running a beacon search. Every compact certified emergency heat pod is paired at manufacture to the transit vessel it ships with, linked to that vessel's emergency beacon frequency. On separation from the vessel, the pod begins transmitting a passive homing signal on that frequency. If the vessel was still operational and transmitting its own beacon, there would be a frequency match available to find. Veth Coral found it in 22 minutes. Velsorin Registry, Transit Vessel Ketharoval Passage. I noticed the name, the same as the station, and filed the coincidence away, which had filed an emergency navigation failure report with the Compact Transit Authority 4 days earlier. Last known beacon position. A transit corridor that placed it within jettison range of the freight route out of Kethsorath. 4 days. The pod had been inside that container, in transit, for 4 days. The primary cell was rated for 72 hours. I did not calculate what the amber reserve light meant in combination with those numbers and the assessment queue on level 6. I had already made the decision I was going to make, and arithmetic confirming it did not add anything useful. Vethcoral filed the beacon match with the Compact Transit Authority under her maintenance credential, flagged as emergency biological recovery with a live subject aboard, condition improving. I filed an amended incoming freight report under my loader credential, noting the pod as recovered compact emergency equipment with a live biological present, current status stable, interventions applied per pod manual. Both filings were accurate. Neither used the word impound. The transit authority would locate the vessel and make contact. The vessel would be directed to Ketharoval Station. This was the standard process for emergency pod recovery. Estimated timeline was unclear, dependent on the vessel's current location and status after its navigation emergency. In the meantime, there was the matter of the next 16 hours, which I did not yet know would be the particular challenge they became. The depot grid ran on shared power with 3 other station sections, and there was a brownout scheduled that evening planned maintenance, a partial reduction in grid output that brought the heating elements to half capacity for a window of approximately 14 hours. It had been on the schedule board for 2 weeks. I had seen it. I had thought nothing about it. I thought about it now. Vethcoral looked at the schedule and looked at the infant and looked at me. She said she would get what she could before the reduction hit. She came back with insulation padding from 3 emergency freight blankets, a temperature monitoring sensor rigged to give a continuous reading on a small display, and a supply of Velsorin-compatible nutritional supplement that she had obtained from the station medical annex on the basis of a maintenance credential, and a description of the situation that was, from what she told me later, entirely accurate, and which the annex medical coordinator had accepted without requiring further documentation. The medical coordinator had also sent a supplementary care guide, 2 pages, which added to the 16-page manual, and which I read twice before the brownout hit. The heating element dimmed at 1840 station time. The break room dropped 4 degrees in the first 40 minutes. What followed was a matter of management. The portable heat lamp ran on its own cell, independent of the grid. The thermal wrapping pad ran on its own cell. The insulation padding from the freight blankets went around the cot and around both of us when I was sitting, layered to hold the heat the lamp and the pad were producing. Vethcoral checked in twice during the brownout, read the temperature display, made adjustments to the padding arrangement, and went back to her shift without commentary. The infant's color began to come back in the 2nd hour. Not all at once, not dramatically. It was the kind of change you could only see because you had been watching continuously, a gradual receding of the ash gray, a slow warming of the skin toward its actual register. I had read the manual's description of what recovery looked like, and I was watching for exactly those indicators, and I saw them arrive one by one. The color first, then the limb tension easing, then the respiration rate climbing, subtle but measurable against the display Vethcoral had left running next to the temperature sensor. The ear points were the thing I watched most closely. I don't entirely know why. The manual had been clear that they were a recovery indicator. Their return from the folded neonatal position toward the upright configuration of a healthy infant was a reliable sign that thermal status was improving, but it was more than clinical interest. There was something about watching something that had been pressed down and closed beginning to open that I found difficult to look away from. They came up degree by degree across the brownout hours, the small delicate structures of them, pale lavender with the faint darker edge at the tip, unfolding in the way that things unfold when they are no longer fighting the cold. She opened her eyes around hour 6. I was sitting on the cot with her against my chest and my back against the wall, and the lamp angled to keep the heat on us rather than on the ceiling, and she opened her eyes and looked at me. Amber gold. The vertical pupil still soft at this age, not yet the clear definition it develops later. She looked at me with the complete attention of a creature that is processing new information, and has no prior framework for any of it. I held still. The manual was clear on this. A recovering Velsoran infant should not be startled. Sudden movement or loud sound during the recovery period could trigger a secondary stress response. I had no intention of triggering anything. I spoke to her quietly. I said some version of "you're all right, I've got you." The specific words have blurred since, the way words do when the moment they were part of is more significant than what was actually said. She blinked. She looked at the lamp. She looked back at me, and then she made a sound. Small, soft, directed at me. The manual called it the proximity inquiry vocalization, a sound produced by Velsoran infants when in close contact with a warmth source, seeking confirmation of continued presence. The appropriate response, the manual said, was continued warmth and stillness and low vocalization. I said I was still here. I kept her warm. I did not move. She made a different sound then, something the supplementary guide from the medical annex described as the satisfaction register. And whatever it meant in precise biological terms, it was clear enough that what had been a question had received a sufficient answer. We stayed like that for a long time. Pale from the cafeteria arrived with the morning cart at 600 and stopped in the break room doorway. She looked at what was in my arms for a moment. She is not a person who expresses surprise visibly. You work in a transit station long enough and very little surprises you, but there was a pause. Then she set the cart aside, went back to the cafeteria, and returned with a meal and an insulation layer from the cafeteria linen supply, which turned out to be warmer and softer than any of the freight blankets. She sat in the second chair, and we had breakfast together without discussing what was happening, because it was obvious and did not require discussion. The other loaders on the Bay 11 team came in for their shifts and managed the bay with complete professional normalcy. Nobody asked me to explain the situation in the break room. On 2 occasions during that first day, someone left something at the break room door without knocking. A thermal cup of the station's particular version of hot grain beverage, which I drink too much of. A small lamp with a warmer light quality than the standard overhead. Rail from the crane team brought a piece of cloth her daughter had grown out of, soft and worn in the way things get when they have been washed many times and handled by small hands. It was better than anything the medical annex had sent. Nobody filed an additional report. Nobody told my supervisor. I don't know how much of this was active decision and how much was the particular culture of a freight depot crew, which tends to handle things locally and report upward only what requires it. Either way, I was grateful, and I said so at the end of that first shift, and the crew received this with the collective indifference of people who are not looking for acknowledgement. The transit authority relay came at 800 of the second day. The vessel Ketharuval Passage had been located and directed to Ketharuval Station. Estimated arrival, 31 hours. 31 hours is a measurable thing. I have spent 31 hours on various difficult tasks in my life, long transit shifts, equipment recovery operations, a particularly complicated container audit that lasted most of 2 days. 31 hours alongside an infant you are solely responsible for, with 1 manual and 1 supplementary guide and no qualifications, is a different kind of measurable. You do it in the same way you do anything you have no choice about. 1 interval at a time, applying what you know, watching the indicators, not leaving. She ate on the schedule the manual specified. She slept against my chest during my shift and in the thermal-wrapped cot during my rest intervals. I slept in the chair with the temperature display on the table where I could check it without getting up, which meant I slept in short intervals and checked the display between them, and this was adequate. On the second day, she made sounds more consistently. The inquiry vocalization in the morning when she woke. The satisfaction register when she was warm and fed. Something the supplementary guide called the exploration vocalization, which I could identify without the guide because it was clearly directed outward, at the lamp, at the ceiling, at the door when Vethcoral came in, at things she was processing and building a framework for. She was, even at this age, conducting a systematic inventory of everything within her perceptual range. I respected this. I tried to give her interesting things to look at when it was feasible. I learned the schedule of her attention across those 31 hours the way I learn most things, by observation and repetition. She was active in the early morning hours, alert and working through her vocalization inventory and her perceptual inventory simultaneously. She slept from roughly mid-morning through early afternoon, deeply settled sleep, the kind that indicated a system running correctly. She was active again in the late afternoon. She slept again through most of the night, with 2 interruptions for feeding that were regular enough to set a clock by. This was her rhythm, and I oriented the 31 hours around it the way I orient a shift around the freight schedule, not fighting it, not trying to impose a different structure, just being present where the rhythm required presence. When she was awake and in the exploration phase, I talked to her. Not much. I am not a person who speaks when there is nothing to say but enough. I told her the names of things in the break room. I described the manual's diagram of a healthy Velsoran infant and told her she was matching it well, which she was. I told her that her mother was coming, which she could not understand but which I found useful to say, because it was true, and because true things said plainly have a quality to them that I have always preferred to silence when silence might be taken for uncertainty. She listened to all of this with the vertical pupil attention that I was coming to understand, was just how she was, thorough, receiving, applying the information somewhere even if the application wasn't visible yet. Veth Coral brought a species reference document on the second afternoon, a compact multispecies contact guide, the standard issue 1, which had a section on Velsoran that was shorter than the manual but confirmed its key points and added several I had not had access to. I read it with the same attention I had given the manual. There was a section on early-stage communication that clarified some of what I had been observing. The inquiry vocalization was indeed what I had understood it to be, and the exploration vocalization indicated healthy neurological development and perceptual engagement with the environment. A Velsoran infant in the first weeks who is demonstrating exploration vocalizations is, the guide said, functioning correctly. She was functioning correctly. I made note of it in the freight report under current status. It seemed like the kind of thing that should be on the record. On the second day, she also found my finger. The Velsoran proximity grip is described in the manual as an automatic reflex, a contact bond instinct present from birth and most active in the first weeks. An infant will grip a nearby object when it enters the perceptual field close enough to register as a warmth or contact source. The grip is not deliberate. The manual was careful to note this, I suspect because whoever wrote it had experienced exactly what I was experiencing and knew that the note was necessary. The manual was correct. It was an automatic reflex. It did not feel automatic. I am aware that this was my response and not the infant's intent, and I note it only because honesty requires accounting for all the data, including the data about one's own state during events. She gripped my finger and held it with a seriousness that her whole face was involved in, the way very young things are serious about everything because they have no scale yet for what matters more than what, and I sat with that for a while before I went back to reading the supplementary guide. The Transit Authority relay updated at 600 of the 31st hour. The vessel had entered the station approach corridor. Arrival imminent. I was in the break room. The infant was awake, in the exploration vocalization phase of her morning, which she conducted at around 500 each day and which I had come to think of as her working hours. I had been awake since 4:30. I had updated all the relevant documentation the evening before, the amended freight report, the beacon match status log, a summary of interventions and current status that I wrote in the plain numbered format of the pod manual, because that is the format I had learned to trust. I did not know what to expect from the arrival. I had been in freight logistics for 9 years. I had processed cargo returns, equipment recoveries, me-shipped items of varying complexity. None of that was a useful frame. I sat in the chair with the temperature display, and the lamp, and the infant who was examining the middle distance with her usual thoroughness, and I waited. Veth Coral came to the break room door at 11:40 station time. She said the vessel had docked. Its registered owner was at the Bay 11 access corridor. She was asking for the freight loader who had filed the beacon match report. I picked up the infant, who interrupted her examination of the middle distance to redirect it toward me, which she did when she was being moved, and I carried her to the corridor. She was tall. Most of the Velsoran I had encountered at the station were close to human height, the cafe workers, the transit residents, but this woman carried height differently, the way people do when it is paired with a particular kind of self-possession. Lavender gray skin, darker than her daughter's, the ear points fully extended and carrying two small markings I did not know the meaning of yet. Silver white hair pulled back. She was in transit clothing, worn, practical, the clothing of 4 days of emergency travel, but transit clothing does not change the underlying facts of a person. She stopped when she saw us. The corridor outside Bay 11 is not a dramatic space. Gray paneling, overhead lights, equipment rack on the left, the pressure seal door to the bay behind me. It is the kind of space you stop noticing after the first month of working in it. She stopped in the middle of it, and she looked at the infant in my arms, and she was still for a moment that I have no good way to measure. Then she closed the distance in 3 steps and put both hands carefully around her daughter's head. I did not know at the time that this was a specific gesture, the Velsoran equivalent of the full embrace a human would use. That cupping both palms around the head is how you say to a child that you have arrived, and that they are yours, and that you are not going to let go. I knew it from what I was watching, which was sufficient. The infant made the inquiry vocalization, then the satisfaction register. The mother made a sound I had no framework for and did not need one, because there are sounds that translate without language because they have never been anything other than what they are. I did not know where to put my hands. I kept them where they were, and after a moment the mother looked up at me. She spoke. My Velsoran is limited to depot floor basics, enough to read freight labels and say the 7 phrases that matter most in a loading bay. She was speaking formal register, which is a different thing entirely. But Veth Coral was behind me, 2 steps back, and she speaks 6 languages including Velsoran formal register, and she translated quietly, without interrupting. The mother asked if I was the one who had found her daughter. I said I was. She asked how I had found her, what the circumstances were, whether there had been time to summon assistance before acting. I described what had happened, the scanner, the container, the amber light, the manual. I described the pod's reserve status as I had found it and the timeline I had calculated. She listened without interrupting. Veth Coral translated, and the mother listened, and her expression changed in ways I could not read precisely, but could read generally, which is that she was receiving information and processing what it meant. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I was the one who had kept her daughter warm. I said yes. She asked how long. I told her, through the brownout, through the 31 hours of the transit continuous presence for the full duration from the moment I had opened the pod. She listened to the translation, and she looked at her daughter, who had located the collar of my jacket and was conducting an investigation of it, and she looked at me. She said something that Veth Coral paused before translating. Not a long pause, Veth Coral does not take long for anything, but the pause of someone being precise. She asked if I knew what it was called in Velsoran family practice, when a person sustained a child through cold response with their own warmth. I said I did not. She told me. Veth Coral translated it as something between bond parent and life anchor. A formal designation, She added, the term used by Velsoran family law for the person who holds a child through the crisis period, who provides the sustained warmth that cold response requires, who keeps the child alive until the family can reach them. Not a metaphor, a legal and social designation with specific meaning and specific implications. I said I was a freight loader. She looked at me. Her daughter had finished investigating the jacket collar and had found, as she found most things in her environment, my finger. The mother watched this with the particular attention she brought to everything, and then she said something to which Veth Coral's translation took longer. She said she knew what I was in the compact's terms. She was not confused about my employment. She was asking whether I would also consider being what I already was, according to Velsoran practice, in her daughter's life going forward. She had a house that had been reduced by circumstances she did not elaborate on, and that I did not ask about. She had a daughter who had been kept by a human she had never met, using a 16-page manual and no credentials and apparent determination. She was not asking out of obligation or cultural convention. She was asking because she had spent 4 days in emergency transit unable to reach her daughter, not knowing whether the pod had been found, not knowing whether the amber light had turned red. And in that time she had thought carefully about what kind of person reads an access panel manual at 2 in the morning and acts on it. And the conclusion she had reached was that such a person was not a stranger in any category of language or law that she was interested in operating by. She said she was asking if I would join her family. The corridor outside Bay 11 was quiet. The bay behind me was running its normal operations. I could hear the equipment sounds through the pressure-sealed door, the familiar texture of an ordinary shift. Veth Coral stood 2 steps back and said nothing. The overhead lights ran at their standard brightness. I looked at the infant. She was warm. She had been warm for 30 hours. Her ear points were fully extended, the folded neonatal configuration entirely gone, and in the corridor's overhead light they were the right color, the healthy lavender of her species at full function, the color I had been watching for through the brownout and the 31 hours and had not quite been able to be certain of until this moment. She had my finger, and she was not going to release it without forming an opinion about the situation, which she was currently forming. I said I needed to think about it. The mother said that was the correct answer. She said anyone who responded to that question immediately was not taking it with the seriousness it deserved, and she required the people in her daughter's life to take things seriously. I said I had gathered that. She said she had gathered that I had gathered it. We stood in the corridor, and the infant conducted her opinions at her own pace, and neither of us tried to hurry her. After a while, Veth Coral excused herself and went back to the maintenance office. Pale came by with the afternoon cart and left it without waiting to be asked. The Bay 11 crew rotated through their break at some point and pretended with a professionalism I genuinely admired that nothing in particular was occurring in the corridor outside the break room. There were things that would need to be understood. There were practical questions of significant complexity. I had a posting at Ketharoville Station, 9 years of it, the depot and the crew, and the familiar rhythms of a place I had long since stopped thinking of as temporary. She had a house on a world I had not heard of, obligations and structures, and a life I knew nothing about. Her daughter had a life ahead of her that would be shaped by decisions made in the weeks and months to come. None of this was simple. None of it was as complicated as a freight scanner beeping in the dark at 2 in the morning, either. None of it was as complicated as reading a 16-page manual and doing what it said. Eventually, the infant released my finger in favor of a new investigation. The hem of the mother's jacket, which had a different texture and was clearly worth studying. And the mother looked at me and asked if I would come to the break room and tell her what I was thinking. I said I thought I understood what she was asking, and I would like to understand it more completely before I answered it. She said that was exactly what she had hoped I would say. We went to the break room. She sat in the chair I had spent 31 hours in, her daughter against her chest, her hand resting on the infant's back with the careful attentiveness of someone who is not going to stop being careful for some time regardless of how settled things are now. I sat in the other chair. The temperature display was on the table between us, still running, reading exactly what it was supposed to read. We talked for a long time. I asked the questions that needed asking, and she answered them without simplifying them, which I appreciated. She asked questions of her own, about the pod, about the brownout, about what the crew had done, about how I had learned what I needed to know when I needed to know it, and I answered those accurately. At some point, Veth Coral brought food and left it at the door without interrupting. At some point, the overhead lamp shifted to its evening register, the slightly warmer light that the depot used during the second half of the station day. By the end of it, I had a sufficient picture. Not complete, completion takes time, and I am not a person who mistakes early information for full information, but sufficient. Sufficient to know that what she was proposing was real and considered, and not an impulsive response to the circumstances of the day. Sufficient to know that the house she was describing was a genuine one, and that a genuine house was what her daughter was going to need, and that she had thought carefully about who belonged in it and why. I told her I would join her family. She said she had thought I would eventually arrive there. I said I read the whole manual before I make decisions. She said she had understood that about me from the Beacon Match report, which had been the most thorough document she had received from the Compact Transit Authority in 15 years of dealing with them, and which was also the document that had told her most of what she needed to know about the person who had filed it. The infant made the satisfaction vocalization from her position against her mother's chest. I have thought about that moment since, because it is the kind of moment that stays. Not dramatic. Nothing that happened on that day was dramatic in the way that word usually implies. No emergency response team, no confrontation, no turning point that anyone outside Bay 11 would have noticed. A freight loader in a break room, a mother who had spent 4 days unable to reach her daughter, a child who was warm, a conversation, a decision, the temperature display reading correctly on the table between us. I am still a freight loader at Ketharaville Depot. I have taken leave twice in the 3 years since, traveling to the house on the world I had not heard of, learning the geography and the obligations and the structures of a life that was already there when I arrived, and that I have been learning the shape of steadily since. My Velsoren has improved past depot floor basics. I have read several books in the formal register. I know what the inquiry vocalization sounds like at age 3, which is different from the newborn version but the same in its essential direction. A question addressed to someone specific, asking if they are still here. The answer is the same as it was in the break room at hour 6 of the brownout. I am still here. That is a sufficient answer. The break room on Bay 11 still has the cot and the 2 chairs and the narrow lamp and the temperature display on the table. I checked it this morning before the first container came in, the way I check things I have been responsible for. It read correctly. The scanner on Bay 11 still throws false biologicals. Veth Coral's repair request is still in the queue. I have stopped flagging it as a priority item. Some things you leave in place because they are doing something useful, even when the useful thing was not what they were designed for. That is, I think, the whole of it. There is something I left out of the account above, not because it is less true, but because I am not certain it belongs to the factual record as opposed to the private one. I will include it here because the private record is what I am writing now, not the depot log. During the second night of the brownout, around 200, the coldest point of the heating reduction, the temperature display sitting at the lower edge of the safe band and not moving, I stopped reading the manual and I stopped watching the display and I just sat with her. Not monitoring, not managing, just present. She was asleep. She had been asleep for 2 hours, the long settled sleep of an infant who has eaten and is warm and has no immediate inventory to conduct. Her ear points were most of the way up by then, the unfolding having continued steadily since the first hours. Her color was good. I could see it clearly in the lamp light, the warm lavender coming in fully, the ash gray gone. Her respiration was in the normal range. All the indicators were correct. I am a person who has lived alone for most of my adult life. This is not a complaint or a statement of loss. It is simply a description of the structure of a life I had built around my work and the routines I had developed, and the specific rhythms of a freight depot where I knew every person and every piece of equipment and every sound. I had not given that structure much thought because structures you have lived inside for long enough stop being visible as structures and just become the shape of things. Sitting in the break room at 200 with a sleeping infant I had found in a container 12 hours earlier, I thought about it. I thought about what it meant that I had not called anyone before opening the pod, and that this had not felt like a choice exactly, more like the next thing to do, the way you move toward a scanner alarm on Bay 11 without deciding to move. I thought about the manual and what it had felt like to read it, the particular quality of attention I had brought to those 16 pages, the same quality I bring to equipment specifications and load-bearing calculations, but arriving at something that felt different in kind from those things even as the reading habit was the same. I thought about the 31 hours ahead of me, and I did not think they were going to be difficult to get through. This surprised me. Difficult is what I had expected them to be. Instead, they seemed to me simply like the next 31 hours, the hours in which the thing I was responsible for required me to be present, and I intended to be present, and that was the end of the consideration. She made a sound in her sleep. Not the inquiry vocalization, something smaller, a sound with no direction in it, a sound that was simply there, the way sleeping sounds are. I adjusted my position so the jacket was closer around her, and she settled again, and the display stayed where it was, and the lamp ran on its cell, and the depot outside was quiet. I read the manual one more time. I had it memorized by then, but reading it again cost nothing and confirmed that I had not missed anything. I had not missed anything. In the morning, I would update the freight report. In the morning, Veth Coral would check in and Pale would bring the cart, and the Bay 11 crew would arrive, and the depot would run as it ran every day. In 31 hours, 30 hours by then, I had been sitting with this for an hour. The vessel would dock and someone would come, and I would find out what happened next. In the meantime, it was 200, and the display was steady, and the infant was asleep, and I had read the manual and done what it said, and I was still doing what it said, which was to stay warm and present and not leave. I stayed. This is what I mean by the whole of it, not just the events and their sequence which I have described accurately above, but the quality of those hours, the texture of being in a situation for which you have no preparation, and finding that preparation, in a certain sense, arrives with the situation. I had no qualification for what I was doing. I had a manual and a willingness to read it and act on what it said, and I had the specific stubbornness that my supervisor once described as my most prominent professional characteristic, which in this context meant that I was going to be in this break room doing what the manual said until someone with more authority than me told me to stop, and nobody with that authority was going to come through that door tonight. Nobody did. 31 hours passed. Some of them I measured and some of them I didn't. She woke at intervals and I fed her, and she slept and she woke. She looked at the lamp for long intervals with the absorption of someone who has never seen a lamp before and is making a thorough assessment of what it is. She practiced the various vocalizations the supplementary guide described, apparently running through each one to verify it still worked, which I found organized and methodical and liked. She investigated my hand with a detail-oriented focus that I recognized as professional grade in its thoroughness. She slept against my chest with a weight that was not much weight but was present weight, the weight of something real and particular that had been in cold response shut down in a container 12 hours ago, and was now warm and investigating lamps. I kept the display in view. I kept the insulation in place. I ate what Pale brought and drank what appeared at the door at intervals, and I did not leave the break room except twice, briefly, for necessary reasons, with Rail from the crane team watching the cot both times because she had offered to and I had accepted. These are the details of 31 hours. Most of them I will not remember with this specificity in another year. What I will remember is the general shape. A person in a break room doing a simple thing for as long as it needed to be done. The vessel docked. Veth Coral came to the door. I have described what followed. The corridor, the mother, the conversation. What I have not described, because it did not fit the sequence I was working through, is what I thought during the pause before I answered her question. She had asked me to join her family. Veth Coral had translated it carefully, the full meaning of the Velsoran phrase, including the legal designation and the social structure it implied, and the specificity of what was being offered. I had said I needed to think about it, which was true, and I thought about it. I thought about the break room and the 31 hours and the display and the lamp. I thought about what it had felt like to read the manual at 2 in the morning and find that it said something useful, and that the useful thing was what I had already decided to do. I thought about the probe of the infant's attention, the way she had directed the inquiry vocalization at me specifically, as if I were the person she expected an answer from. I thought about her finger grip on mine, which the manual said was automatic and which was automatic, and which meant something specific to me that was not in the manual. I thought about the structure of my life at Ketharaval Station, the 9 years of it, the routines and the rhythms and the familiarity I had built up without quite noticing it. The structure was real and it was mine. It was also, when I examined it during those 30 seconds in the corridor, not the whole of what was possible. I had not known that before 31 hours ago. I knew it now. I said I needed to think about it because that was true, and because taking the question seriously required acknowledging that it was large. But I had already thought about most of what needed to be thought about, and what remained was the practical questions, which the subsequent conversation answered. She is a person who answers questions directly and completely and without simplification, which is a quality I find essential in anyone I am going to make decisions alongside. This, more than anything else I learned in the break room conversation, was what settled the remaining part of the decision. The infant's opinion on the matter was clear from her general behavior throughout. The 3 years since have been, I am not a person who reaches for strong adjectives, but accurate is what I have available. They have been the most substantive years I have spent since I came to Ketharaval Station. I travel twice a year. I have learned the formal Velsoran register well enough to have real conversations in it, not just transit floor transactions. I know the geography of the house on the other world, the particular quality of its light in the morning, the sounds the building makes. I know the child at age 3, which is a different thing from knowing her at newborn, and equally specific and equally hers. She still makes the inquiry vocalization at me. The adult version of it is more sophisticated, more language than sound now, questions with structure and vocabulary, but the direction of it is the same. She asks me if I am still here. I tell her I am. This is sufficient as it has always been. The scanner on Bay 11 beeped this morning at 6:20. I checked. It was a thermal-wrapped equipment package, not biological. I logged it, cleared it, and moved on. The display in the break room reads correctly. The manual is in the access panel of the heat pod in the depot equipment storage room, where I filed it after the incident, because it is a useful document and useful documents should be where people can find them. Everything is accounted for. That is the whole of it.